Good afternoon. I told a friend that I would be speaking at Libertopia, and she asked me what I was going to be talking about, and I said private communities. And she says, private communities, what's that? I said, well, it's like a condominium, for example. And she said, you're going to spend 45 minutes talking about condominiums? I said, well, I wrote a whole book on it, you know. She says, oh, okay. Let's see, is this page down here? Yeah. So what private communities, the word private, what does private mean? Well, economists divide the economy into two sectors, the private sector and the government sector. So the private sector is whatever is not in the government sector. And that includes private communities. Now, I know somebody previously said there's no such thing as government. But if you think of government as the most powerful user of force within some territory, you know, we have, you know, people with guns, you know, that people have a mental construct of calling it government. So the government sector is the coercive sector of the economy. And the private sector, or the market sector, is voluntary. So what does it mean to have a free market? It means an economy that's voluntary for everyone. So all activity, production, trade, consumption is voluntary. People have a free choice. But that goes to another question. What does it mean to have a free market? What does it mean to have free choice or to have freedom? So what is freedom? Freedom means voluntary action. As I said, everything is voluntary. But then you go one step before that. What does it mean for an action to be voluntary? And to distinguish what's voluntary from what's not voluntary requires some ethic. We need an ethic that gives us rules by which we can know what does it mean for an action to be voluntary. And for the market to have a universal application so that wherever you go in the world, regardless of culture, we know what a market is. Then there has to be a universal concept of what's voluntary, which implies the ethic that tells us what's voluntary also has to be universal. There must be a universal ethic if we are to have a universal meaning of the market. So where would this universal ethic come from? It can't come from anything that we observe. It can't come from any culture or actual practices. It has to be derived from something common to humanity, which is our human nature. And the philosopher John Locke had two premises by which he based his natural moral law on: equality and independence. That we are equal as human beings, morally equal, and our independence, we are individual in our thinking and feeling. Some people might dispute these premises. If you don't believe the premises, right, then you're not going to agree with anything else I say. But if you accept the premises, I'm not going to spend a long time arguing for them. I just assume that they're true. Then from that we can derive a universal ethic. I have derived that in my book, The Soul of Liberty. John Locke provided...
If you're going to assume that aren't we just preaching the converted, and then if the rest follows?
Everything I say is preaching to the converted. So we're all converted, right? Now, John Locke never derived natural law. He stated the premises and he stated the conclusion. But he never actually derived it, and he said he never derived it. So I derived natural law, or the universal ethic, in my book, The Soul of Liberty, which subtitled Universal Ethic of Freedom and Human Rights. If you're interested in the derivation and its application, you can go down to the bookstore over there and get a copy. So, but I'll tell you what the universal ethic is, because then you'll understand what a market is and what it means for something to be private. So there's 5 rules in the universal ethic. A benefit is an act welcomed by the recipient. If you do something because you think it's good for that person, right, that's not a benefit. It has to be welcomed by the recipient. And benefits are morally good. Harm is an invasion into another person's domain. Now, there's a distinction between harms and offenses. If something is merely offensive based on your beliefs and value, it's not a harm. It has to be an invasion into somebody else's domain or property. So number 4 is the important rule. All acts, and only those acts that coercively harm others, are evil. And all other acts, if they're not good or evil, they're morally neutral. So all acts are covered. It's comprehensive. So the pure free market includes everything that's voluntary, including self-governance. See, the distinction is not between market and government, because market has governance in it, institutions that have governance and rules. So the actual distinction is between voluntary governance and imposed government. So the free market better coordinates, better innovates, better liberates than government. So here's the kicker. Here's something you need to understand. If you understand this, and you didn't understand it before, it'll be worth the price of admission to the whole conference. And that is that, see, the universal ethic establishes voluntary action and the meaning of the market. Therefore, the market is inherently ethical because the market is defined by the same ethic as that by which justice is judged. The same ethic, the same universal ethic by which we judge what is just and fair, also established the market. So the market is inherently just, and anything that deviates from the market or from voluntary action is unjust to that degree. All right, when we talk about private communities and public goods, the contrast is with what is public. Unfortunately, the word public in English and in economics has two different meanings. One refers to the people. The word public came from Latin publicus, meaning the people. And the second meaning, completely different meaning, is the public sector, which is government, as in public schools or public libraries. In fact, the word public school originally meant a school intended for the benefit of the public. It came to mean a school ran by the government. So private, the word private has two different meanings also, unfortunately. You have private goods, which means individually used. So the word private and private goods does not mean provided by private enterprise. When you get a passport from the government, right, that's an individually used goods, that's a private good. Public goods are collective goods. Like the screen here is a collective good. You're all looking at the same screen. It's non-rival because one person looking at it does not reduce another person's ability to look at it. And some people also distinguish between excludable and non-excludable goods. Can anybody here think of a non-excludable good provided by government? Yeah, I can't think of either. So the distinction is really dissolves when you really analyze it. And they also call club goods collective goods that are excludable. Everything government provides is basically a club good. And private communities provide club goods. So what's some examples of private communities? Well, there's two kinds of private communities. One is proprietary, which means having a single owner, and the other is an association of co-owners. So examples of proprietary communities include hotels. This hotel here is a private community, right? Ships, shopping centers, office buildings, marinas, land trusts, they're all examples of proprietary communities. Now, what about an apartment house or apartment complex that has a single owner, like a landlord or the manager, and people are renting from this landlord? How many think that is a private community? Raise your hand. The apartment house with a landlord, private community. How many think it's part of the government? Nobody? Okay, good. What about a duplex where you have one building with two owners, each with half of it, but they have common elements like the roof and the gardens, and they have a contract with one another? Would that be a private community? Let's see. How many think it's government? Okay. What about a condominium? You have units that have an owner, but they have an association of co-owners, and so each member owns his unit and a share of the common elements like the grounds, the parking, and so on. How many say that's private in the market? Okay. How many say that's government? Okay. Nobody. Good. So a few people may think so, but I'm glad nobody here thinks so. So condominiums, cooperatives, homeowners associations are all private communities in the private sector. We all agree there? Good, good, okay. So what's the difference between these associations that are voluntary and a city government? They provide similar public goods. The governance structure is quite similar. You elect the city council, and the members of a condominium vote for the board of directors. So the structures are similar. So what is the difference? There's two main differences that I see. One is the private community, like homeowners association, have an explicit contract. When you move into a condominium or a housing co-op or a residential association, they give you, here's the master deed, here are the bylaws, and here's how we can change the bylaws. Here's the dues, here's the structure of your assessments, and then there's a line where you sign. You sign it indicating your agreement. If you sign a contract, that's a real agreement. At least you're saying you agree to it. If I move into a city, some people have said, well, the fact that I'm living in a city means I agree to the laws. But I say, how can I agree if I don't agree that I agree?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the second element that's different in associations versus city governments or other governments is that the members of the board of directors of an association are legally equal with the members, in contrast to a government. In a government, the officials have sovereign immunity, right? Whereas in a board of directors of a private community, they can be sued if they don't agree to the bylaws, if they violate their duties. So the members of the board of directors, or the chiefs, whoever they are legally equal with the members. So you have legal equality and explicit contracts, and I think that's the key difference. So residential associations, they're clubs that provide collective goods to their members, and they have rules. In real estate, they're often called CC&Rs, conditions, covenants, and restrictions. A covenant is basically a contract to do something or not to do something. There can be covenants without residential associations. And people also have other kinds of contracts like an easement. If you have an easement, that's the use of somebody else's real estate as if it was your own, or it can be a contract that the other person can't do something. All right, so governments use force. Government is imposed. The governors are tyrants to whatever degree. And so, therefore, many people say government should be limited because it has the use of force against our will. But when you have voluntary governance, what are the limits? Right? You can't impose limits on voluntary governance. It's whatever the community wants to do. They can have more restrictions than in a typical city, or they can have fewer restrictions. Now, Spencer McCallum, who is attending in this conference, he wrote a book called The Art of Community and other works on private communities. He's kind of like after reading him, he was a big influence on me. I'm kind of following in his footsteps. So McCallum said, the same agency that performs public services also performs disservices, cannibalizing society with taxation. So that's a schizophrenia. You have the government. It's like when I go on a highway and I see a highway patrol car, a police car, on the one, and then I become afraid because he might cite me, even though I'm trying to drive safely. I mean, I never deliberately violate the law, yet I've been cited, So I'm afraid. On the other hand, I'm glad he's there because if I have an accident, he can be there to get help. So that's schizophrenia. So the government, why do we want government? To protect our property. So where does the financing come from? Well, it comes from our property. So they're taking our property in order to protect our property, right? That's incoherent. So the solution is private communities. They provide not only public goods, but rules, covenants, and their enforcement. The state has a government and territory. A club is voluntary and contractual it can have a territory, but not necessarily. David Paedo earlier talked about associations for mutual benefit that were not necessarily territorial. You had social clubs that do not necessarily have territory. But in a libertarian world, the primary community would have some kind of territory, I believe. So what kind of things can be private and what things can't be private? Well, I can't think of anything that cannot be private and contractual and voluntary. Everything can be private. Now, what you can have is you can have local communities, whether they're proprietary or civic associations, and then when there's some services where you have economies of scale or a larger scope. For example, mosquito control. The mosquitoes don't care about your boundaries. They go around in a large area. So even if you get rid of your mosquitoes in this area, if you don't know over there, they can come over and bite you. So communities can associate. 20 or 30 local communities can form a higher level association. From the board of directors, they will select representatives to this higher level association so they can provide public goods of greater scope, like mosquito control or maybe freeways and highways. And these higher level associations themselves can associate. So you can have regions that get together in a network or association, and they have an even higher level association. So this multi-level structure can go all the way to a continent where you provide continental services. And most people would be in the network because they provide you with a package of services. And so the benefit of that package is more than the cost. There might be a few hermits or other people that are not in there. They wouldn't matter too much. Just like this hotel has elevators, and there's no charge to ride the elevator. So you could say, what about free riders? Anybody can come here and use the elevator. That's a free rider problem. Well, it's no problem. Most of the people here who are using the elevator are paying customers. So a couple people on the elevator, it's not going to do any harm. So in private communities, I'm thinking of geographical communities. So their public goods are territorial. They impact a particular territory. For example, streets, parks, security, fire protection, all of these things mostly affect the territory that is serviced. Most users are within that boundary. So these collective goods make the area more attractive and more productive. So what does that do to the rent and land value? You'd rather live in an area that has better security, better schools, better parks, and so on. So there's a greater demand to be there. That's going to increase the market rent and the land value based on that rent. These collective goods generate rent. So the local users are not free riders. They have to pay to be there. Right? They have to either pay higher rent to a landlord or higher cost when they buy the land. They're paying to be there. They're paying extra. So the users of these collective goods are not free riders. So who is the free rider? If it's not the users, who is the free rider? When government provides collective goods, like a park and streets and security, the users are not free riders. They're double billed. They have to pay taxes to finance those goods and the greater rent. Right? They have to pay higher rent and taxes. The typical worker-tenant is double billed for public goods. So if they're being double billed, somebody else must be subsidized. Who do you think that is? Well, they're just getting a salary, maybe too high a salary, but they're getting a wage. The double bill, the subsidized agent is the landowner. Because the landowners are getting higher rent and higher land value for goods provided by government, paid for by mostly others, by taxes on labor, taxes on enterprise profits, taxes on the sale of goods.
I think the single taxers called that the social increment.
Yeah, the unearned increment, right. So, but when private communities provide the collective goods, there's no double billing, right? They collect assessments, which is essentially the land rent generated by those services, and that finances the public goods. They don't tax you. If you were to go to this hotel and say, I want a room, and say, what's your income? We're going to base the room charge on your income. What would you say? None of your business. I just want to pay for the room. It's worth this much to me. So they collect rent, and the rent finances the good. There's no double billing, and there's no subsidy. The public goods become self-financing. They generate the rental, which is then used to pay for the public good. And it's efficient. There's no, what economists call deadweight loss or excess burden. And the rent also provides the optimal amount. The optimal or best amount of a collective good is that for which the extra rent generated by an extra amount equals the extra cost. Think of a developer with a big apartment complex. He has to decide how many swimming pools to produce. Swimming pools are expensive, right? If he has too many, then an extra swimming pool is not worth the extra rent they can get. On the other hand, if there's only one pool and it's going to be real crowded, he could have built a second one that would have been worth it. So that's an actual real-world decision. And the basic economic principle is where the extra benefit reflected in the extra rent is equal to the extra cost. Economists call that marginal rent, marginal cost. So this hotel provides elevators efficiently. That's the public transit here, the elevator. Because what's the cost of one more rider on the elevator? How much? What's the physical cost of extra energy? One more rider on the elevator costs what? Practically nothing. And that's what they charge. It's efficient pricing. Because the room pays for the collective goods. Likewise, condominiums, homeowners associations, and cooperatives provide collective goods efficiently by using the rental generated instead of nickel and diming you for each little thing like transit. Now, there's other elements involved in private communities. There's transportation. In the typical city, the streets are crowded, right? Because they're mispriced. And so there would be congestion tolls in streets and freeways just high enough to eliminate congestion. They might charge people when they pollute. They might have private jitneys in between, between a taxi and a bus is a smaller vehicle like a van. Cities typically allow them for the airports and don't allow them for other kinds of transit. You'd have jitneys and vans that would provide public transit. You would not have fuel taxes, you would not have gasoline taxes, and there'd be no carpool lanes because those are inefficient. You can ask me about those later. Yeah. All right. Also, typical cities have zoning, which is inflexible, and they're often there for political reasons to protect some interests and prevent people from moving in and increasing density and so on. So there'd be no zoning in a private community. What you have instead is covenants and easements. Covenants are private contracts, and easements is a contract to use somebody else's property. The associations would have their own bylaws and master deeds. So this is, or if it's a single owner like a corporation or a single landlord, you'd have proprietary governance. The lease agreement is a contract between tenants and landlord, and it becomes private law. That's the law of the property. So I envision a way to achieve a free society using private communities. We try so hard to have tax reform and reduce the budget deficit and all that stuff. What if we just had a law at all levels of government, at the state level, county level, city level, saying that you can create a private neighborhood. You can privatize your neighborhood. And it's not so strange because they have this in St. Louis. In St. Louis, they are called private places. It's legal in St. Louis to privatize your neighborhood. And now the association owns the streets and the lighting and things associated with it and pay to maintain it. So we can have like partial secession Allow neighborhoods to privatize. And if a lot of them do that, they can then associate with others and replace what governments do with what associations of private communities do. Allow secession and tax substitution. In other words, if the association can do its own garbage collection, it should not have to pay to the city taxes that pay for the city garbage collection. Just like for schools, if you pay tuition to a private school, you should not have to pay the taxes that finance the government schools. So with tax substitution and secession, I believe that's the most effective way we can move towards a free society. So this is the book I wrote in 1994, Public Goods and Private Communities, in which I established the theory of private communities and refuted the doctrine of market failure for public goods. And then I have case studies of actual communities and how they are financing their collective goods. I have a homeowners association, a condominium, Walt Disney World as a private community, the private places of St. Louis, a land trust in Delaware, and so on. So what's my main message in public goods and private communities? That there's market success in providing public goods, both in theory and in practice. The demand for these public goods is reflected by the rent people are willing to pay for the territorial goods. There are no free riders. The users pay rent. And they can either be proprietary or residential associations. And there's a lot of thought, there's a lot that has been written over the history about private communities, starting with Thomas Spence. In 1775, he wrote about leaseholds, where people, you have an association that leases land and pays rent for the collective goods. So it's an old idea. Ebenezer Howard, also in Britain, in 1902, wrote a book about garden cities, which was then implemented to a large degree by a lot of communities like Reston, Virginia, that has lakes and forests. He wanted country and city to be married, to have lots of country within the city. Then Spencer Heath, the grandfather of Spencer McCallum, wrote a book, Citadel, Market, and Altar. He was a pioneer of the concept of the proprietary community. And then Spencer McCallum, who's attending here. Is he here? Oh,
Not here yet.
yeah.
Still upstairs.
Oh, well. Anyway, he wrote Art of Community, as well as several other books. Art of Community, written in 1970. And the book, The Voluntary City, which you can see back there, is a great book on various aspects of private communities and some history. So, what's this? Yeah. So, to sum up, the doctrine of market failure that you see in typical economics books and scholarly works, people think that the market fails for public goods. The excuse for government is market failure. So if the market doesn't really fail, there's no excuse for government. There's no rationale. So the doctrine of market failure overlooks the fact that we can have private governance in private communities. And there's another thing it overlooks, and that is the motivation of sympathy. Economists often talk about self-interest. The other motivation is sympathy for others, which Adam Smith recognized. He wrote two books. One was The Wealth of Nations, based on self-interest. The other was The Theory of Moral Sentiments, based on the recognition that the other motivation is sympathy for others. After all, in the United States, churches are voluntarily financed. And where does the money come from? It comes from donations because people sympathize with that particular creed and community. And Space and Rent will provide the financing for private communities for the whole continent with these multi-level bottom-up associations. If you're interested in going over this, I have this PowerPoint in this website here. So, any questions? Yes?
Is there a right of exit from private community?
Very good question. You don't have a private community or a contract unless you can exit. If you can't exit, you become a slave to the contract, and then it's not a voluntary contract. So a voluntary association has to include exit, perhaps at a price. Just like marriage, If you don't allow divorce, what happens? You become a slave to the marriage if you don't like it anymore, if you're not in love anymore. So yeah, there must be exit. And sometimes it can take the form of leaving, or it can take the form of secession in some cases. If it's feasible, if you have like single-family houses or neighborhoods, they can secede. So many communities might have the secession option. Yeah, good question. The question was, some condominiums and homeowners association have many, many rules and restricting what you can do, what kind of pets you can have, whether you can have an American flag on your window. Huh? Lack of clear rules. Okay, so so in this network of private communities, when you move into the association, you are presented with the bylaws and the master deed. These are the rules. And now some people don't read the rules or don't read them carefully. They just sign. And then they're surprised because they can't have a large dog or some other restriction. So first of all, you know, you need to read the rules because you're signing an agreement. Now, the bylaws and master deed are like the constitution of the community. And sometimes the constitutions may not be clearly written, right? So you need an understandable constitution. Here are the rules, and here is how we can change the rules. Now, if the bylaws don't say that you're not allowed to have an American flag, and then they vote to restrict it, they're going beyond what the bylaws say, because the bylaws, you know, anything that's not prohibited should be permitted. That's our, you know, that's what freedom is. And so, and you should be able to sue them if they violate. Well, first of all, you should be able to recall the members from the board. If a lot of people are unhappy with these rules, that you should be able to recall the board and elect new members. And if that, or if you're in a minority and other people aren't with you, and you feel the board has violated the bylaws, ideally you'd be able to sue them in court for violating the bylaws, going beyond, you know, what they said. A private community and contracts in general are, in a truly free market, exist within a legal system. And we have a dysfunctional legal system. Maybe the lawyers can help me out here. But in a proper free market legal system, we should do what England does, I believe, and that is, if you have a lawsuit, the loser pays. So if you win the lawsuit, right, the loser would pay your legal costs as well as his own legal costs. And then you'd have a lot less legal litigation. But then if you do sue legitimately and win, you know, or let's say you're sued improperly. Let's say it's a malpractice suit against a doctor that really didn't do anything bad. The doctor has to pay all these legal costs, right? If he wins the lawsuit, then the loser should have to pay all the legal costs. One of the case studies in my book, Public Goods and Private Communities, is the village of Arden, Delaware. It was founded in 1900 as a land trust by followers of Henry George, who wanted to show in practice that the collection of rent could be a practical way to finance the collective goods. And the founders were individualists. They didn't want to be bounded by lots of rules. And it's still that way today. So in Arden, Delaware, they don't have architectural covenants. You can build your house any old which way you want. You can paint it any color you want. You know, they don't tell you, you know, what kind of flag you can have or anything. So I think in the market where you have lots of private communities, you would have communities with very few rules for people that didn't want to be bound by that. You'd have other communities with lots of rules if people thought that better preserved property values, that you don't want old clunkers, you know, in somebody's front yard, and so on. So I think you'd have a mixture, and you could, you know, you would vote with your feet as to which community you thought was best for you.